everyone. Welcome to Method. This is our new space and the first external event that we've put on since being in this building. So I'm going to introduce Claire Rowland. Claire is the person we've come to see. She has extensive industry experience, both in design, energy, consumer and IoT. Did I miss anything?
That'll do.
Yeah, that'll do. So she's going to be sharing her wisdom with us for about 40 minutes. And then when we're done, we'll go back over to the other side where the booze and the food is. And Claire will be happy to answer any questions and we can chat and catch up there and follow up. Okay?
Thank you.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking about consumer challenges in decarbonising energy. So a slightly more introduction here. I'm a consultant specialising in product management and experience design for what I call IoT-enabled services. So I'm not a hardware designer, but I've done a lot of work with hardware, things enabled by hardware, and particular focus on clean energy tech. Also the lead author of this book. There are a couple of them out the front if anybody wants to have a look, and I might even be persuaded to give them away if anyone's really interested. I've worked on all kinds of IoT type thing all the way through, for everything from breast pumps, industrial power tools, skincare, two of those with Method a few years ago, smart metering, connected home, supply chain, commercial IoT, industrial, automotive, developer tools, lots and lots of different things. But I am particularly passionate about working in clean energy tech. I'm currently working, this is probably far too tiny for those of you at the back to read. I'll explain a little bit more about it later. I'm currently working with an organisation called the Energy Systems Catapults. You might be familiar with some of the UK's Catapults. They're Innovate UK funded not-for-profit innovation agencies. We have a thing called the Living Lab, which is a test bed of nearly 1,800 real UK households, varying degrees of instrumentation in them, who've agreed to sign up and test new energy products and services. Within that, we have something called the Whole Energy Systems Accelerator, which allows us to test things not just with people in their homes, but also to understand the impact that might have on the network. So if we've got time at the end, I'm going to show you a little video as a plug for that. So what I'd like to go through is here's some of the stuff. Most people don't really think about energy very much. I've said power here. I'm actually pretty much going to be talking about electricity because that's one of the main, turning things over to electricity is one of the main ways that we can decarbonise. We can debate the other ones over a drink if you want to. How the power system will have to change as we decarbonise. How we might balance supply and demand to make best use of renewables. That may be a familiar concept. It might not. That's okay. What the impact on consumers might be, and one here for the kind of designers, what the opportunities for design innovation to help consumers might be. I'll go through some examples. One of the things I do want to say is what I'm talking about here is primarily about the UK. The issues are pretty similar across different markets around the world. You know, physics of electricity are the same, you know, wherever you are, but the structure of markets can be a bit different. Obviously, climates can be different. You know, some of the issues will be a little bit different. So again, happy to chat over some of that with a drink later. Now, I'm old enough, probably shouldn't admit this, I'm old enough to remember a few sort of dim vignettes from the mid to late 1970s, which are mostly brown because it seemed like everything was kind of brown back then, and people looked like that. And back then, one of the things I remember is eating dinner on a camping stove by candlelight because we used to have rolling power cuts. And the reason we had rolling power cuts was because the power workers kept going on strike, but also the coal miners kept going on strike. And when there was no coal, we generated most of our electricity from coal. So when there wasn't enough coal, there wasn't enough electricity. Back when I was 3 and wearing lots of brown polyester, I thought this was all quite exciting, but I'm sure it was vastly more annoying to the adults around me. But this isn't the experience that most of us have of electricity now. Now, certainly those of us who live in urban areas, your experience might be a bit different in rural Scotland. But a power cut is really very, very rare for us. We think of power as being a bit like water, you know, it's just kind of there. We don't think about how it gets to us, where it comes from. It's just there when you need it, and mostly that's fine. But this kind of model relies really heavily on carbon emitting power generation. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. For most people, because I said they don't really think about how this gets to their homes, their main kind of artifact in their relationship with energy is a bill, which might look something like this or like this, depending on who your supplier is. There's lots of common elements on those. Basically, it comes once a month or once a quarter and goes, you use this much and it costs you this much, and that's really about all there is to it. And obviously, right now with the energy crisis, a lot of people are very, very concerned about their bills. These are some figures from 2015 around the sort of breakdown of fuel poverty around the UK. As you can see, at that point, it was pretty common sort of to be somewhere between kind of 15 and 20%. This spring, we're anticipating that when the energy price guarantee comes to an end and changes and government support comes to an end, we're going to have at least 35% of households in fuel poverty. This means people not turning the heating on. Around estimated 7,500 people die in the UK every year from inadequately heated homes. So this system that we have it's not. We need to decarbonise it, and also it's just not working. So lots and lots of things are going to have to change. We're actually doing quite well, to say, on decarbonisation of power. So this is all our power generation, just the massive rollout, particularly of offshore wind in the UK. You can see this line here, probably not very clear from the back, are carbon emissions from the power sector have been responsible for driving most of the UK's carbon emissions. So we're doing really, really well at building low carbon generation. What this doesn't include is things like heating and transport. Most of us heat our homes with gas. Most of us still drive petrol cars and take petrol fueled public transport. We move other things around. This isn't just consumer here. We move other things around powered by diesel. And so in order to achieve substantially more emissions, what we're going to have to do is electrify as many more of those things as possible. Because once you've electrified something, you can decarbonise it. There are other routes, as I've said, but this is the main one. And in order to do that, the power system is going to have to change to deliver that. This is a graph that shows what a typical day of electricity consumption for homes in the UK looks like. This is midnight. This is midnight. What you can see is the sort of dips overnight. Then there's a peak in the morning, a small peak in the morning. People get up, they start showering, cooking breakfast, that kind of stuff. Dips off a little bit in the middle of the day. These figures are pre-COVID. Obviously, many more people doing kinds of jobs that we do can now work from home at least part of the time. But you still do see these two peaks. And then there's a much bigger peak in the evening where people come home, start cooking dinner. Maybe it's dark, the heating's going on, the lights are going on. Some of them might be charging EVs, that kind of stuff. So there's this huge peak here. One of the problems that the network operators have, like National Grid, is the fact that we're not all, if we're all using the same amount all day, it would actually be quite easy to know how to supply that. So it's anticipating these fluctuations that is a big part of the challenge. Just quickly, how do we generate it right now? Well, I picked April 22 just as a random month. In that month, we generated nearly 50% of our electricity from zero carbon sources. That's probably quite a good month, but it's reasonably indicative. And that's things like wind, nuclear is zero carbon, solar, and a little tiny bit of hydro. And then, of course, we're still using quite a lot of gas. We still need to import some stuff from other markets, partly because we shut down loads of our nuclear power stations, and so now we rely on the French to kind of make up for that. But this is, you can see, we're kind of getting there. We're not doing too badly. One of the challenges, though, is that as we start to electrify more things, particularly heating and transport, we're going to need more electricity. These are some National Grid future energy scenarios. They're projecting that by about 2037, we're going to be using roughly 100% more electricity every day than we were, a couple of years ago. And also, perhaps a more challenging kind of thing to deliver. That the peak demand is going to go up by about 50%. So that's that evening peak that's really hard to kind of fulfil, especially if it's dark outside and maybe not very windy. And so they reckon that somewhere between 2037 and 2045, those peaks are going to be 50% bigger than they are right now. Now the problem with wind and solar, it's all brilliant. The problem is that, I'm sure you know, that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And that doesn't always match up with, so the times when you have renewable electricity don't necessarily match up with the times when you actually want it. This slightly technical looking graph shows about sort of a 6-day pattern, and the black line here is demand. So you can see there's the kind of the daytime peak, and then it dips overnight. And then this green line here is showing renewable generation over the same 6 days. So sometimes this green line is much lower than the black line, and sometimes it goes above it. And when it goes below, that means there's not enough power being generated from renewables to fulfill consumer demand. So we have to make that up, I think, with things like gas power stations. And then when the green line goes above the black line, that means that there's more renewable energy being generated that's going into the system than people are actually trying to use at that point. And if those things get out of balance, it causes all kinds of complex technical problems with the grid that I won't attempt to explain here. So what happens here is something called curtailment, and that's basically when the national grid will pay renewable generators to stop generating. And I saw these stats the other day, and I found this quite sort of shocking. Basically, last year we spent £215 million paying wind farms to switch off because not enough people wanted that electricity at that point. And then we spent another £717 million turning on gas power plants when there wasn't enough when there wasn't enough electricity at times of high demand. To replace the wind power that we would have generated had we needed it at the point at which we could generate it. That's like £1 billion. And in the process, we emitted an extra 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide. So clearly the situation is a bit nuts, and we should try to address it. How do we do that? Well, most of us don't really think about supply. I'm sure we know what supply and demand economics is. Most of us don't think about that kind of day to day in relation to electricity. But that's essentially what we're trying to do, is to align that demand with align that supply with demand. And if both of them were perfectly matched the whole time, that would be amazing. It's not going to happen, but you know. So what kinds of things can we do? Well, the first one is storage, basically batteries. And these can be big grid scale things. We're starting to see these things emerging, rolling out now. Still very, very early days. But you know, you've got loads of excess wind. What do? You stick it in a battery. You can do other things like use the electricity to turn seawater to produce hydrogen from seawater, which you can then burn later to generate more electricity, or you can use that to power trucks. It's not a very efficient process. It's an option. It may be useful, but it's not something that's going to be the answer to everything. In our homes, we can also have batteries as well. Increasing number of people are starting to get these, particularly people who've got solar PV. You can also use the batteries in EVs as a place to stick excess electricity. You can also do things with hot water and heat storage. We're doing a trial in the Living Lab at the moment of a heat storage unit. I won't explain the technical details right now, but essentially you can heat things up before you need them, and if you can keep them warm, then you can heat them. You can shift the electricity that's needed to do that heating around a little bit. The other thing we could do, you may have been hearing the term demand side response perhaps kicking around the last few days. You might have heard of this national grid scheme to pay people. It's called demand flexibility scheme. So they've been trialling this. They ran the first couple of sort of non-trial kind of proper sessions this week. Offering sort of via various energy suppliers. If your energy supplier supports it, they might have been in touch with you to say, if you can reduce your electricity consumption between 5 and 6 p.m. It was Monday and Tuesday this week. And you need to have a smart meter to prove what your consumption would normally have been between those times. Then you get a bit of a cash incentive to do that. And this is an example of basically what we used to do. Was to dispatch generation to meet demand. So if the national grid would know that during an ad break on Christmas Day at sort of 3 o'clock in the afternoon, lots of people go and make a cup of tea, and so they bring some hydroelectric power stations in Scotland online to kind of to sort of serve that anticipated demand. So we used to plan around when people would use it and try and make sure that we had the generation in place to do that. What we're talking about doing now is flipping that around and saying, well, we can't control when the generation happens because, you know, wind, sun, those kinds of things. So what we need to try to do is shift that demand that people have and get them doing things at different times. And so this is an example. It's kind of a, I suppose it's a trial. It's been, I don't have the figures for the whole of the country. We've seen a statistically significant reduction in energy consumption from our Living Lab homes over the last couple of days during that hour. So less than a kilowatt hour per home over the course of the hour. So it's not a huge amount for an individual home necessarily, but you know, across, if you scale that up across you know, thousands of people around the country, that's actually quite useful to the system. And that's just one example. There are various ways that you can get people you can get engaged consumers in this kind of thing. The first one is simply asking them to do something different, which is what the demand flexibility scheme did. There's another example here. This is a National Grid app called When to Plug In. It gives you information about the carbon intensity of the grid. So if there's lots of renewable generation happening right now, it will be green. If we're relying very heavily on gas, it will be red. This is saying, well, if you've got a choice about when you charge your car or when you run your tumble dryer or something like that, your best bet if you want to be green is to do it at 1:30. This is another example. This is automation. So if you don't, obviously, relying on people to act in the moment and say, please, would you mind charging your car at a different time? Would you mind not running the dishwasher right now? That's really inconvenient. You're not going to get very many people to do that at scale. So the next best thing is services that will automate that. You might know about EV smart charging. This particular example is called a service called EV Energy. Most people come home early evening, plug their cars in, and they charge straight away during the sort of the main peak time on the grid. If you use a service like this, you can tell your car or your charger when you actually want to have that charge in your car, which typically might be the next morning, and it will work out either based on your energy price tariff or based on the carbon intensity of the grid when the best times to charge might be. So it won't necessarily start charging straight away the moment you plug it in. It might start charging at 1 o'clock in the morning, or you know, and turn on and off overnight. So that's a lot more convenient. The way you incentivize people to do this is very often through pricing. This is another example of a service that does a little bit of automation and relies a certain amount on behaviour change. It's called Equi. We work with them in the Living Lab. They basically try and get lots and lots of consumers to take part in turning down their electricity consumption during these peak events that they call Equi events. If enough people, if you take part in it, you get some points or some kind of rewards back for doing that. The problem is, it can be really hard to set those incentives at a level that's interesting enough for people to participate. This is an example from a demand flexibility service. This woman said, well, E.ON, her supplier, told her to cut her consumption by 20% and said they'd give her 5p if she managed to do it. So this is an example. It is worth a certain amount. There are markets in flexibility. This is a commodity that gets traded. And the tradable amount of it is kind of worthwhile to the organisations who are involved in that trading. But when you chop it up into little bits and pass it on to the end consumer, very often what you end up with is an incentive that's not really very exciting. So there's a lot of work required to figure out ways of making that, of gearing that so that it's both worthwhile for the networks and also worthwhile individuals to participate. Some other things we can do. You may well have heard of time of use tariffs. These are quite well worn now. Economy 7 for heating has been around for storage heating, been around for a very long time. They've sort of risen up again in prominence as more people get electric vehicles. This particular example is Octopus Go, aimed at EV drivers. Gives you a relatively high rate. These figures are a bit out of date, so don't get too excited. It's probably much more expensive now. Gives you a relatively high rate for 20 hours of the day, and then a really low rate for 4 hours overnight to charge your car. And that's a really good start. Problem is, it doesn't scale. With what happens if you've got a relatively small number of people with EVs, brilliant. There's lots of nice green energy kind of knocking around in the middle of the night, and you can sell that to them really cheaply because there's not much demand. As more and more people start getting EVs, what happens is you create another peak in the middle of the night. Our Living Lab participants are generally quite a savvy bunch. We've got a relatively high proportion of people with EVs, and we're already seeing another peak in the middle of the night for people on tariffs like that. Another way of pricing that is dynamic tariffs or agile tariffs. This is Octopus Agile. This is something where you don't know what your price for energy is going to be very far in advance. 24 hours in advance, you'll be given pricing. The price changes every half an hour. You get notified 24 hours in advance what the next day's kind of price bands will be. Sometimes it might be really expensive. Generally, it is really expensive right now because that's just where energy prices are. But sometimes there might be so much excess power knocking around in the system that you're basically being paid to take it off them. And this is obviously not really suitable for people like, people who have to make decisions about like, oh, well, great, I'll go and run the dishwasher and are trying to do all this stuff kind of, manually. But if you've got devices that can automate, that can take this information in and automate it, this is what EV smart charging services often run on. There are heat pump controllers coming out that will also take in agile tariffs and energy management systems that will take this in, and maybe if it's cheap enough, they'll stick it in your battery as well. So it does require kind of a certain level of technology to be able to participate. And it's worth saying that even if we do all of the storage and all of the demand response and all of the other things I've been talking about, it might very well still not quite be enough. So we're going to have to figure out ways that we can kind of continue to support that demand without relying entirely on intermittent renewables, and that might well mean nuclear, or it means things like biomass and hydrogen and some of those other things we don't think are quite as sexy as wind and solar. So in terms of what this means for consumers, I just want to start by talking a little bit about what drives people's behaviours around energy. And then generally we see that there are kind of four things, and many people have some combination of these. It will change from individual to individual. It will also change depending on their life circumstances. Nobody doesn't care about cost. Everyone cares about cost to some extent. Some people care about it a lot more than others. Comfort, that's your own comfort, or maybe the comfort of other people, or looking after other people. Some people really hate being cold. Some people can't be cold for medical reasons. Convenience, if you've got a lot going on or you're just not very interested in thinking about it, obviously you're not going to do things that are going to require a massive amount of effort from you. And environmental concern tends to be last for most people, unfortunately, but it is there, and some people are much more motivated by this than others. Now we see that there are geeks, and I say that kindly. We have lots of them in the lab who are really, really engaged, really want to do the right thing, kitting their homes up with all the equipment, and that's amazing. But any solution, energy is a mass market product. We all use it. Whatever we come up with as a way to try and decarbonise the system has to work for absolutely everybody. So we can't rely on people being highly engaged in order to be able to invest a lot of money in order to be able to decarbonise. And I think I'm sure the designers here will agree that really, really good mass market service experiences don't require people to think very hard, and they don't require very much of them time-wise. The challenge is we're probably heading to a situation where most of us are going to have to start thinking at least a little bit more about energy and making some different decisions, or getting used to having some different services in our lives. Challenge there is right now most of us don't understand it. Most people don't know what a kilowatt hour is, and they freak out when it's like, oh, tell me what I'm using in kilowatt hours, just tell me in money. And it's like, well, that makes it really hard to compare what you used last year with what you're using this year, because the money part has changed. This does change when they get an EV and they've got a dashboard in front of them that tells them how many miles they're doing to the kilowatt hour instead of miles to the gallon. So even if they can't explain the physics of a kilowatt hour, the unit becomes a bit more familiar. The other thing is that a lot of them don't realise, and I used to work for a green energy supplier, a lot of them don't realise that just getting your energy from a green supplier is not enough. If you are using electricity that you think is, you've bought from Octopus or Rovo or whoever at 7 o'clock in the evening, unless you're in Scotland, the chances are that the electrons that you are personally receiving in your home were not harvested by wind pixies or something. They probably come from a gas-fired power station, because that's just what's happening on the grid at those times. So the fact that your supplier agreed to buy a certain amount of renewable capacity from some generator at some unspecified time doesn't mean that that's what you're getting right now. So it can be really hard to persuade people to change, because very often they think they've already done their bit. The other thing is that a lot of these solutions right now rely on variable pricing as an incentive. And so you get people like Greg Jackson from Octopus, who I have a lot of respect for, but he's very much a free market economist, who will say things like, it makes no sense to pay wind turbines to turn off. Don't disagree with that. We need to create incentives for customers to buy power when it can be generated cheaply. Don't necessarily disagree with that either. The challenge is when you translate that into consumer services, it's not fair on everybody. Some people have to cook their kids dinner, at a certain time. You can't feed toddlers at 2 o'clock in the morning just because that's when the electricity is green. Some people need to run ventilators, electric hoists, charge mobility scooters and those things. And they can't necessarily choose to do those things, at different times of day. So we have to create services that balance that kind of supply and demand thing with things that are fair to everybody. The other kind of experience challenge is that doing this flexibility stuff means ceding a certain amount of control. Now, in the case of EV smart charging, there's lots of evidence now. These are quite robust, mature services. Most people are happy to do that. As long as you get the charge in your car when you need it, you don't really care whether it happens, at time X or kind of a couple of hours later, as long as you get the outcome you want. When you start translating that over to things like heating and cooling services, there's a very kind of direct perception of what's happening at that point. If you turn somebody's heating on a couple of hours earlier and you turn it off a couple of hours earlier than they were expecting, they're going to notice that, and they might not like it very much. And so we have to be much clever in the way that we design these kinds of services to make sure that people aren't sort of becoming uncomfortable and becoming disengaged with this. There's a really extreme example here, which I'm sorry you probably can't read at the back. A bunch of people in Texas, this is a couple of years ago, opted in via their power companies to a scheme that allowed the power companies to raise the temperature on their, or lower the temperature on their heating, or raise the temperature on their air conditioning in times of very, very high demand on the grid, without really understanding what was going to happen. Then there was a heat wave. Lots of people's air conditioning got turned off in quite extreme temperatures because lots of people wanted to run their air conditioning and there was too much demand. And people's bills went through the roof because a lot of them were on Agile tariffs. And so lots of very, very unhappy people, and lots of people who were quite seriously struggling in the heat. So that people have to understand what they're opting into here, and we have to design these services in a way that gives them a fair amount of protection. So I think there are strong elements of fairness here. Energy is an essential service. Everybody needs it. As I said, this has to be. We have to think about, we have a fair futures team in the Catapult who think specifically about vulnerable customers. This is really important. Everyone needs to use energy. Then there's affordability. Low carbon technologies, energy efficiency measures can be quite expensive up front. People on low incomes are not necessarily able to tolerate energy price fluctuations. They need to know what they're going to pay. So we have to think really hard about affordability. Then there's access. So, some of the products and services that come out, exclude people who can't install equipment, or exclude people who can't, may rely on internet access, and can't exclude people who don't have that. Sometimes people who don't use the internet are not people who can't use the internet, they're people who can't afford data at that point. And we're seeing more and more of this at the moment with the cost of living crisis. And then there's just the complexity of it, even for people like me who work in the industry. Know a little bit about it. It can be really confusing to navigate all of the different conflicting advice, find the right grants, know who's going to be a reliable installer, who's going to do a good job of all of this stuff. I don't know how we're going to get here in time, quite frankly, with things like heat pumps, given how complicated this is, and how little most people know about that right now. So. Wanted to kind of give a few examples of what we might do, what we might be able, some of the levers might be for consumer innovation. And the first thing I wanted to say to a room full of some of you designers is very often when I talk about this stuff with designers, what they say is, oh yeah, behaviour change, yeah, we'll just nudge people. And I go, it's not 2010, take a deep breath. So I'm not saying that there's no value in this stuff. But I do think it's disingenuous to frame this as an issue of individual responsibility. I think we can't be trying to fix people. We need to be trying to fix the system. And frankly, most people engage with this stuff, they save about 2% of their bills, and that's not going to be enough. So yes, by all means, think about that, but really it isn't enough. Let's not try and fix people. Let's try and fix the system. That means things like innovative products, services, looking at markets and policies, which we don't always get influence over as designers, but this is part of the system in which these products and services are created. And it's also about the infrastructure. And again, I'm not suggesting you will go out and become power systems engineers overnight, but it's worth understanding how all of these things work together. So to try and frame this as are we all still doing how might we's? I'm still doing how might we's. To try and frame this as a kind of designer's favourite trope, some of those things might be, how do we help shift demand as much as possible to times when clean energy is available? How do we make clean energy, low carbon technologies affordable to everyone? How do we deliver better outcomes so people are actually warm and comfortable? Many of them are not right now. How do we make updating homes and reducing carbon from energy use simple as possible for people who aren't experts? And how do we make pricing fair? So we don't penalise people for essential uses they can't shift, but we also give them an incentive to be doing where that's possible. Few examples. First one, this is Octopus again. They're trying to get the cost of a heat pump, which is £6,000 at least for a typical home right now, down to the cost of replacing a gas boiler. They're not quite there yet. They bought a heat pump company, but they're working on it. Another example, and this is a US one. This is a company called Block Power. They are aimed at building owners, particularly buildings that have a lot of lower income residents. And they're targeting the building owners with an offer to install low carbon heating, cooling, hot water, save them money without any upfront cost to the building owner. Simplifying retrofit of old buildings is another one. This is a company called Sealed, again in the US. There is a startup, one of my former Catapult colleagues has founded, called Ferb Now in the UK, which is emerging to do a very similar thing. They basically come in, survey your home, and if you want them to, they'll find somebody to do the work, arrange all of that for you. And in the case of Sealed, if they don't save you money in a given month, you don't have to pay them back for that month. So, it's taking some of that complexity and risk out of it. Then there are creative products. This is something called Heater, which I keep trying to say in a Geordie accent, which will make no sense to any Americans that might watch the video. I won't do a Geordie accent. Imagine it. But basically, there are a couple of products that are coming out like this. They replace your hot water cylinder with a cloud computing device and use the waste heat from the cloud computing to heat your water. I have lots of questions about this, but it's an interesting idea. This one's not a solution. This is a challenge area, home energy management. What happens when you've got an EV? You've got PV, solar PV, you've got a battery, you've got appliances, you're generating, you've got a heat pump, you've got all of these big loads and things that working in the home. If they're all individually talking out to the internet, talking to different services and trying to optimize themselves, what happens is they're not working together, and what happens for the home as a whole might be all these things that essentially end up fighting with each other inadvertently. So there's an emerging market, it's a bit bigger in Central Europe at the moment, emerging market for home energy management, which is devices and services that help all of those things work together. And there's some interoperability standards emerging around this. It's very much like the smart home was a few years ago. Then there's policy. I'm going to plug another Catapult example. As an example, this is something called warm home prescription. A couple of my very brilliant Catapult colleagues had the idea that there are lots of people who are struggling to afford to heat their homes who can become very ill if they don't have adequate heating. These are very often people with respiratory illnesses, and they can become so ill that they end up in intensive care and needing a lot of care from the NHS. Wouldn't it just be easier if we paid their energy bills instead, so they didn't get cold and they didn't get sick? So they ran a trial of this, a small-scale trial a couple of years ago, running a bigger trial of 1,000 homes at the moment. I can't give you results, but it's going well. We're getting lots of interest from other NHS authorities who are interested in running this. And it's just, if this works, it's such a no-brainer, isn't it? Then there's local energy. So this is, at the moment, if you generate energy yourself, you sell it into the grid and then you buy some other energy back from the grid. There's no way for you to sell that to your neighbours. What if you could just do that and then we didn't have to send it all the way around the country? That would make sense, wouldn't it? We don't have quite the infrastructure and the policies in place to do this right now. But what we do have is, there are ambitions to move towards that. And what we do have is schemes that allow local communities to partner with local generation and say, well, if they generate at the time that they're generating, we can buy cheaper power to the level that they're generating. And it's not like the same electrons kind of moving around, but it's kind of essentially in market terms, it's the same thing. And that allows communities to get cheaper power and ultimately removes the need to kind of send electricity halfway across the country, which is a whole other world of pain. And I want to finish up just by plugging a little video of the thing I'm working on at the moment. What we do is test with real consumers, but we also test with, we're also able to test for network and system impact of innovations and say, what if we had a policy that we can create those conditions and test that people. I'll let the video explain it a bit better.
So the Whole Energy Systems Accelerator is a collaboration between the Catapults Living Lab and the Power Networks Demonstration Centre.
The NDC, we're part of the University of Strathclyde and we're a test and demonstration centre. We're involved in accelerating technologies from early stage development through to commercial realisation, through testing, validation and simulation. We work with a number of major organisations, distribution network operators, major manufacturers and small companies to deliver that outcome.
So the Living Lab is a community of homes across the UK. We use that Living Lab to test out different products or services, all relating to low carbon technologies.
We can trial, for example, new technologies in people's homes and we can scale that to replicate many hundreds of homes potentially with the same types of technology. Replicate that on our network at PNDC to understand how large-scale takeover of these technologies will impact on networks, understand what type of network solutions are needed to actually accommodate these new technologies at both consumer and network level.
So at PNDC, we will receive the signals from the multiple homes that are connected in the Living Lab. And once we get the signals, we emulate it in such a way that it looks to the electrical distribution network as it is connected to a single distribution network.
And we can see when the network is getting stressed by having too much demand placed on it by consumers at the same time. And we can turn that stress signal into a signal going back to the homes in the Living Lab, asking them to change their energy usage behaviour. And we can send that request back to them as a price signal or a simple request. Or we can explore new ways of engaging with consumers around energy usage.
An example would be, let's say there a whole neighbourhood is deploying electric vehicles. Each of those will have a charger in their home and they'll be using that charger at different times of day depending on their particular requirements. What we can do here is replicate through an understanding of the real data from the Living Lab, understand how that energy is used within the electric vehicles in the consumer end, replicate that here in real hardware to understand the network impacts, and see how ultimately how much of that technology can be accommodated without interventions at the network level or at the consumer level.
And that allows us to see the impact of these homes, including the low carbon technologies that are connected to these homes on the network, like what happens to the voltage, what's happening to the current, are there any voltage imbalances, etc. That information is then passed on to the market model.
The WESA facility allows us to test out that full loop of consumers within their homes, new technologies, and the impact on the network. So we can test out future business models, market arrangements, and see how they impact the real physical infrastructure, and enabling us to design a net zero energy system that is a lower cost as it possibly can be.
Okay, thank you. Happy to take questions. Are we taking questions, or are we having a drink? I don't mind. Whatever you wanted to do.
Thank you, Claire. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you, Claire. How many homes are in your test group?
1,700 and something at the moment.
Very good.
I was looking at Tableau this afternoon, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's 1,700 and something. So we say it's nearly 1,800.
A decent
Yeah.
number. Anybody else got any questions? There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we're often looking at the kind of behavior side and sort of talking about that. And as you say, like, it's really important to look at not trying to put that on the consumer. And I've seen a lot of sort of talk about, I don't know what they're called, but these kind of potential energy generators. They kind of lift a big block of concrete. I don't know if you've seen these. Lift a big block of concrete into the air, and then when the energy is needed, you drop that concrete and it creates the energy. And conversations happening about using old mines and things for that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that's something that's... I don't know.
I don't know anything about that.
You don't know anything about
I mean,
that. In that case, well, I've got another question in that case.
Yeah, well, just to say,
but it's an
just to
interesting,
say, I think we need all the solutions we
yeah,
can. So
there's never one solution. You need to have
Yeah.
as different things as possible. But I think that's really cool. And one of my colleagues, we had this kind of like strategy day when we were talking about coming up with lots of different ideas. And he was talking about energy within people's homes, and but from the point of view of housing efficiency and like making people have the most efficient houses. But a lot of the problem is that renters don't often, most people in the UK are renting property, so they don't have the ability to change those kinds of things. And I wonder whether that's something that you've looked at all.
Yeah, and there are probably people I work with who looked at that on a much more deeply than I have. But I think this is one of those things where it's like, it can't be about the individual, it needs to be about policies. I think there are minimum requirements now, so this is about policies that determine who can rent a property and which properties can be rented and what characteristics they have. I think we already have a law that says that in order for a property to be privately rented, it has to have an EPC rating of E or above, which isn't brilliant, but you can't, I think it's F or G, I think it's F or G, F and G, or at least G, that you can't rent out. So you can't rent out the very, very worst properties anymore. And it's about incentivizing the landlords and incentivizing the, just creating the carrots and the sticks that make the landlords fix it, basically.
Really interesting. Briefly on the blockchain point, my brother investigates cryptocurrencies and blockchains, and frequently it's not sexy enough to sell a database upgrade. So frequently people will jump to blockchain as the panacea and savior of that. And I fear this might be a similar circumstance there, where better tracking of it would help with the challenges faced here, but it may not necessitate that. My question about the pilot that you're on, how many of those homes have EVs? And is there any investigation about the return to the grid from there? Because this one is the one that's really interesting for me could this solve some of the really big brownout or blackout issues, where local issues becoming a national issue, but stopping it at the source almost?
Yes. So how many have got EVs? I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I think we've got 200 or 300 and something who've told us they have an EV with a charger. It might be more than that. Not everybody has a home charger. Somewhere between 300 and 500, I think. Some of those are using EV energy, which is a service I showed earlier. We have a few integrations, we're building more. So we have an integration to EV energy, and people who've linked their EV energy account and have a home charger that's compatible, or a car that's compatible, we can read their EV consumption. We can also potentially control their EV charging if we want to.
Can you go the other way though? That's the question. From the EV to the grid, or to the house, or to the power wall if they've got
V2G.
one. Yeah.
So or V2X. So we are doing trials within the Catapult of so V2G is vehicle to grid, V2X is vehicle to something. Sometimes that's using the power in the energy in the EV battery in the home. So yeah, we are currently reliant on EV energy's ability to support that. They are doing trials at the moment, so we haven't done trials of that within Catapult with other partners who have V2G chargers. We've not done that in the Living Lab yet, but we've got an integration that's due to start supporting that at some point.
Very interesting. And just for the room, if anyone wants to upskill on this, Technology Connections is a really interesting YouTuber, I suspect you might have come across them, who talks about what heat pumps are and these sorts of challenges and what the future might be. I think the thing from vehicle to grid that's the problem is getting the money. So and for instance, being able to charge your car on someone else's PowerPoint as well. Like if you can track where the money's actually going, and that might well be a blockchain use case, because that's the problem. Who's going to actually implement this? No one's going to do it for free.
Well, I think there's an argument for metering big things like EV charging, which can theoretically be shifted differently from stuff like cooking your kids dinner. It's not that easy to implement. I worked on early stages of a trial a few years ago with a meter manufacturer who were trying to make a EV charger with a smart meter built into it, just to do that thing, so that you could meter it differently. It's not out there in the world yet.
Exactly. I'm going to suggest that we go through to the kitchen next door, where you can have some food, some drinks. Claire's going to hang around, take the questions. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.